Good evening and welcome to the fifth installment in the St. Ambrose Academy Spotlight Lecture Series, sponsored by Children's Dental Center of Madison. Throughout the year, we've been welcoming hundreds of guests into our classrooms by giving you a peek at who we are as faculty and what we are imparting to students each day in our Catholic classical curriculum. We have just one more talk in the series this semester, and you can find more info about that and check out the previously recorded talks at www.ambroseacademy.org/spotlight. There will be some time at the end of my talk tonight, so please do type in questions in the chat box in the comment section, and we'll get to them at the end. All right, I'm very pleased to be with you tonight. My name is Miss Katie Behrens. I went to the UW-Madison for my undergrad, and then I got my master's in library and information studies. But tonight I am presenting on one of my favorite topics, fairy tales, fantasy, and the Catholic faith. And I realized the timing was actually quite fortuitous, as tomorrow we celebrate St. Patrick and the great nation of Ireland. What a perfect time to delve more deeply into the fair folk. Now, this topic is surprisingly vast, like a tree with many branches and offshoots. The root of this particular tree, for me, is J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. Tolkien was the first author I knew to be Catholic and to defend fantasy and fairy stories, which soothed a conflict in me I didn't know I had. Reading Tolkien's work brought me to a multitude of other Catholic and Christian authors and philosophers over the years, namely C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, and George MacDonald, who was both a minister and a writer of fairy tales. George MacDonald is actually a featured character in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, which it's easy to miss him, so watch for him the next time you read The Great Divorce. For this lecture, I've chosen to focus on the way fairy stories can form us as readers, though Tolkien has even more to say on the role of authors. But that is a lecture for another day. In this talk, then, I hope to show that fairy stories prepare their readers for a life of faith. All right, so we need to define some terms. What do I mean when I say fairy story? Is that the same thing as a fairy tale? Yes and no. When we think of fairy tales, we think of a set canon of literature. Things like Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, all of Disney's greatest hits and then some. Or the stories collected by the Brothers Grimm, Francois Perrault, and Andrew Lang, among many others. But when our four Christian authors say fairy stories, they mean much more than just folk tales collected by scholars, and certainly more than stories about diminutive pixies. These men come from the land of Arthurian legend, as well as a rich medieval and Renaissance history and tradition. In British literature, Beowulf slays a great dragon. The powerful magician Merlin serves at the king's court. King Titania and King Oberon grace the stage for Shakespeare. And Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen Edmund Spenser takes his readers on an allegorical journey filled with wonder in that poem, where the land of fairy and men sort of coexist. Magic and mystery, deeply rooted in the land, are part of the cultural heritage of Britain. So to limit the term to what we think of as fairy tales, especially those just collected in France and Germany, is to ignore that rich British tradition. It is easier then to describe the mood of fairy stories rather than to define it head on. Tolkien writes, "The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm, a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates be shut and the keys be lost. This is a world marked with mysteries that cannot be solved and wonders that cannot be explained. It is vast and deep, full of both beauty and treachery, and usually only your wits can save you. In the realm of fairy, you can get into real trouble by drinking from a sacred pool or rubbing a lamp, even by accident. Although some stories end happily, some end in sorrow. To apply this general mood to a few well-known fairy tales, we can point to the fairy godmother in Cinderella, who gives the poor girl a bounty of riches to go to the ball, but also places a harsh restriction at the toll of midnight. Or consider the Witch of Hansel and Gretel. How exciting to find an entire house made of candy, and how treacherous and deadly the consequence for indulging. Even the more traditional Arthurian poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a mysterious knight entirely in green, interrupts a feast to challenge the court to a game. One of them can cut off his head today, but the Green Knight gets to repay the favor in a year. The whole story is imbued with eerie mystery, which is never exactly resolved or explained. The world of fairy brings great wonders, but also great danger, and it eludes our efforts to pin it down. Fairy stories, then, are much more about mood than they are about form, meaning, or topic. They should be, as George MacDonald says, mood-engendering and thought-provoking. But there is another quality which is far more important in fairy stories, and that is something that Tolkien calls secondary belief. You may be familiar with the command to suspend your disbelief. We can see this most clearly in the theater. We go to the theater, we all know that the things in the play aren't real, and so we take our disbelief and just set it aside. Tolkien says that secondary belief is the opposite of that. You do not need to suspend or ignore your disbelief because the world of the story is so complete that inside it you believe it to be real. The moment disbelief arises, Tolkien says, the spell is broken. For a fairy story to work, the magic of the world must be treated seriously, not smirked at with a wink and a nudge. For example, in Rapunzel, no character within the story questions that her hair can hold a person. And in Beowulf, of course there is a dragon terrorizing the countryside. This is the way the world is, and there's very little funny about that. This internal consistency is a vital part of why fairy stories work. It's also the most important element in expanding the term fairy stories past fairy tales. At the time that Tolkien wrote his essay in the 1930s, tales of magic and wonder of worlds other than our own weren't as common as they are now. We can see that what Tolkien considers fairy stories are part of the genre we now call fantasy. The author presents a world different from our own, with magical or supernatural elements, but internally consistent. If the story is good, we are swept up into secondary belief. If the story is weak, we may start finding the inconsistencies and cracks. Going forward, I will interchange the terms fairy tales and fairy stories, but with the understanding that fairy tales is heavily tied to tradition, while fairy stories is a more open category, including modern works of fantasy. Now that we have a better foundation for what falls into the category of fairy stories, we can turn to the question at hand. How do these stories, more than others, prepare us for a life of faith? The answer that probably comes to you first is that they teach lots of good moral lessons. And that is true. Fairy stories almost always feature a triumph of good over evil. Additionally, traditional fairy tales have all kinds of rewards for goodness and punishments for wickedness. Perhaps that is why we like presenting them to children and lose our taste for them as adults. But more on that later. However, if we present them to children merely to teach them a lesson, we rob fairy stories of their full power. In his book, The Uses of Enchantment, child psychologist Bruno Bettleheim stresses that adults should read fairy stories to children, but resist the urge to moralize. Fairy stories are unique because through the shaping influence of time, and not merely the work of a single author, they came to convey at the same time overt and covert meanings, came to speak simultaneously to all levels of human personality, communicating in a way which reaches the uneducated mind of the child as well as that of the sophisticated adult. Bettleheim used fairy tales in his practice with children and found that a child would fixate on a particular aspect of the story which went unnoticed by most adults, yet served as a key to understanding the child's predicament. We never know what might get through to a child. To assume that we know that what will is to assume we fully understand another person's mind, and we must be humble enough to admit that we don't. As a teacher of literature, I say with great conviction that any story which leads to only one definite thought is a bad story. That's as true for Anna Karenina as it is for fairy stories. George MacDonald compares the fairy story to a sonata or to nature itself. He asks, does nature ever suggest only one definite thing? Does she make any two men in the same place at the same moment think the same thing? Is she therefore a failure because she is not definite? Is it nothing that she rouses something deeper than the understanding, the power that underlies thoughts? Such ought the fairy tale to be. By comparing the fairy tale to a sonata earlier in his essay, MacDonald is intentionally raising it to a high art, which we also see here reflected in nature. The beauty of nature, created by God, and art, made by man, is their capacity to suggest meaning upon meaning. That is their success and not their failure. If we were to boil a fairy tale down to a single lesson, it would be like cutting down a tree for firewood, useful, but robbed of its beauty and power to change us. Now, this is true for any piece of literature. What sets fairy stories apart from other tales for children? One thing Bettleheim suggests is that it is the magical element, the fact that the story comes out of Never Never Land, that allows a child the imaginative space to understand the world and work out their conflict. The child can swing back and forth between recognizing the truth of the world and the fiction of the story. For example, a girl hears the story of Little Red Riding Hood and can recognize the truth that strangers sometimes can mean you harm, yet still believe that no real strangers ever meant her any harm. It's a sort of Schrodinger's cat for the imagination. In that way, stories of fairyland uniquely help children to understand themselves and the world. Additionally, fairy stories inspire us in our natural desire for goodness. The morality presented in fairy tales is both overt and covert, as Bettleheim says. Yes, a child reads in these stories clear prohibitions. Don't stray from the path. Don't stay out past midnight. Don't be too proud. Breaking these rules can lead to dire consequences. But true morality isn't just following a set of rules. It must pierce into our hearts and become a deep desire to do good and love others. Fairy stories help us develop our desire for goodness. Bettleheim writes, "It is not the fact that virtue wins out at the end which promotes morality, but that the hero is most attractive to the child, who identifies with the hero in all his struggles. Because of this identification, the child imagines that he suffers with the hero his trials and tribulations, and triumphs with him as virtue is victorious. The child makes such identifications all on his own, and the inner and outer struggles of the hero imprint morality on him." Excuse me. Fairy stories typically condense evil into a single character or force and goodness into the hero or heroine. By presenting the hero as attractive to us, the fairy story invites us to develop a love of goodness, of light, of love. Now, Any of my students can tell you that I love complex characters who are pulled in many directions by both virtuous and selfish desires. People in the real world are complex, and most of our stories should reflect that. But we also can't deny that we love stories where good triumphs over evil. By nurturing our natural desire for goodness and love, fairy stories prepare us to eventually move beyond the set of rules into moral freedom. Now, up until now, I have been speaking directly to the good of reading fairy tales to children. But children are certainly not their only audience. Most of us were presented with fairy tales when we were children, and we like giving them to children. For those adults who think that a child's innocence and naivete allow them to buy into a tale of magic, childhood seems the best time for a person to read them. Excuse me. But is there any inherent connection between fairy stories and childhood? Tolkien says no. The truth is that some children like fairy tales and some don't. Those who like them as children are prone to like them as adults. And most children, if given the choice, would pass them by for other kinds of stories. If you have spent time around a variety of children, you can probably recognize that some like stories about magic, but many want to play at being grown-ups with all the ridiculous mundanity of going grocery shopping or talking on the phone. Most children like a mixture of both fantasy and familiarity, and so do most adults. Fairy stories are therefore worth reading for children and adults alike. Lewis says that as we age, we should strive to keep hold of the good things we enjoyed as children while we add on the good things of adulthood. Likewise, we should shed the bad habits of childhood while we embrace the good habits of maturity. He says, the sooner we cease to be as fickle, as boastful, as jealous, as cruel, as ignorant, and as easily frightened as most children are, the better for us and for our neighbors. But who in his senses would not keep, if he could, that tireless curiosity, that intensity of imagination, that facility of suspending disbelief, that unspoiled appetite, that readiness to wonder, to pity, to admire? The process of growing up is to be valued for what we gain, not for what we lose. Not to acquire a taste for the realistic is childish in the bad sense. To have lost the taste for marvels and adventures is no more a matter for congratulation than losing our teeth, our hair, our palate, and finally our hopes. It's a bit of a downer there at the end. Fairy stories still have things to teach us as adults then as well. Moving on to my second major point in this essay. So one thing that Chesterton, Tolkien, and Lewis agree on is the way that fairy stories change the way they see the world. The wonder and the magic of such stories imbued the whole world with wonder and magic. This is not because they couldn't tell the difference between reality and fantasy. Far from it. Chesterton devotes a whole chapter to the ethics of Elfland in Orthodoxy, his memoir of conversion, explaining how fairy stories contributed in his journey toward accepting God. As with any of Chesterton's writings, his meaning is hard to tease out, but in essence, he speaks of fairyland as a place of both reason and wonders, where the test of the imagination is key. You cannot imagine 2 and 1 not making 3, but you can easily imagine trees growing golden candlesticks or tigers hanging by the tail. We believe that a beanstalk climbed up to heaven, but that does not at all confuse our convictions on the philosophical question of how many beans make 5. The existence of magic in fairy stories did not confuse Chesterton's reason, but it did give him an attitude of wonder towards the world. If an adult were to tell him, "This is the way the world is," he might have responded, "Well, who says it does?" Fairy stories present us with all kinds of logical connections. Touch this spinning wheel and you will die. Blow this horn and the giant's castle will fall. Plant this bean and it will grow to the sky. Therefore, nothing explained to Chesterton as a boy why the world existed at all. He says, the world was a shock, but it was not merely shocking. Existence was a surprise, but it was a pleasant surprise. Chesterton then adds later, stories of magic alone can express my sense that life is not only a pleasure, but a kind of eccentric privilege. For Chesterton, life became full of meaning, excitement, and delight because he had been raised on fairy stories. And the feeling that life was a privilege, like a wish granted, had to mean that it was a privilege given by someone. The magic of the world indicate that perhaps a magician was at work. This perspective, offered uniquely by fairy stories, is what Tolkien calls recovery, or regaining of a clear view. It is far too easy to lose the wonder of our existence and become placated or bored with daily life. If, for example, we became tired of primary colors through our familiarity with them, we might think that only a new color would excite us. Instead, we should recover the excitement we had as children to learn that blue and yellow really do make green. How amazing. Tolkien says, we need in any case to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Tolkien explains this last word, possessiveness, saying that we lay claim to things that are familiar. We think we know them, and we think we know them, and so we lock them away, stripping them of their power to astonish us. When bread becomes too familiar to us, for example, we refuse to let it astonish us, thinking we understand it. We understand bread. But how beautiful and magical is the rising and baking of bread. That's true magic right there. Fairy stories then give us the chance to see the world with fresh eyes. By reading about magical lands, our eyes are keener to see the wonder all around us. C.S. Lewis tells us that fairyland, far from dulling or emptying the actual world, gives it a new dimension of depth. He does not despise real woods because he has read of enchanted woods. The reading makes all real woods a little enchanted. I can tell you that that was very true of my own childhood, and I hope I have kept enough of that same spirit to continue to delight in the world. Of course, if fairy stories merely helped us connect with the world around us, that would be nice, but not all that different from reading in general. On the contrary, fairy stories are uniquely able to prepare us for what is to come after this life. By the simple fact of presenting readers with an alternative world, they stretch our imaginations to what may be possible. As Chesterton explains in Orthodoxy, just because the world is as it is, does not mean that it must necessarily be so. By imagining other worlds in fairy stories, we get to explore what could be possible outside the constraints of our physical world. In his essay, Tolkien boldly claims the word escape to describe this aspect of fairy stories. While most of us are used to hearing escapism in a negative way, Tolkien spins it to the positive. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. One could take this analogy too far, of course, but Tolkien is inviting us to question why we should limit ourselves to thinking and talking only about what we observe in the real world. As Christians, we believe that this world is not our home. We were created for something greater. To think and dream about what may be on the other side is only natural. Tolkien says this is the difference between the escape of the prisoner and the flight of the deserter. We are not deserting the world. We are escaping for a brief time to our home. Coming back around to psychology, Tolkien also suggests that fairy stories speak to our deep desires to be reconnected with the natural world, especially to be able to speak with animals. This is one of the reasons why most fairy or fantasy stories take place in a sort of generic medieval Europe, a time before the Industrial Revolution and mass mechanization. Deep down, we long to return to harmony with nature, as Adam and Eve were before the fall. Coming around the bend toward the conclusion, then, I must return to my original question. How do fairy stories or fantasy prepare us for a life of faith? I hope I have shown that fairy stories have the capacity to deeply form our morality, not by treating any given story as a lesson to be learned, but by allowing them to work on our imaginations. Our imaginations then turn to behold the world afresh, to see the world God has given us as arrestingly wonderful, a gift which we do not deserve. And that same imaginative power allows us to dream of a world that was and will be again, to hope for the restoration of all that has been lost. But I have saved the best for last. More important than everything else that fairy stories give us is the happy ending. In my, in my younger and more arrogant days, I turned up my nose at the happy ending, and now I crave it. Tolkien coins the word eucatastrophe to describe the sudden and usually unlooked for turn at the end of fairy tales, which makes everything all right. Catastrophe from its use as the turn of a Greek tragedy, but the prefix EU, meaning good, the same as we find in Eucharist. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, or good news, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. The fairy tale reflects our faith. We too have been saved by the sudden and miraculous grace of Jesus Christ, who triumphs over sin and death, and we have glimpsed unspeakable joy. Thank you. I put my paper over here. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Like I said, there is a lot that I was not able to get to in this particular talk. And so I'm happy to take any questions. I've got one up here. All right, so we have a question. What is my favorite fairy tale or story to teach to students? This is actually kind of a hard question because, so I love this topic, but it's really a little bit more suited to younger children. Teenagers are kind of in this place where they're not really interested in that. They kind of have to like move through the teenage years to then appreciate fairy tales on the other side. My colleague, Dr. Skemp, is the one who gets to teach medieval literature, but I taught it 1 year, and I absolutely adored teaching The Fairy Queen. There's actually a picture book, very, very well illustrated, well-renowned, that sort of summarizes the first book of The Fairy Queen, and that is really good too. But The Fairy Queen just has stories of like deeply rich descriptions and lush environments, which is really, really fun. All right. So if an adult wants to dig more into fairy tales and this kind of topic, do I have recommendations where to begin? Absolutely. So as I said, so this is my copy. It's called Tree and Leaf, and it is a collection of Tolkien's essays on fairy stories, his poem Mythopoeia, which also is like really rich in this topic, and a story called Leaf by Niggle, which also kind of crosses over in that way. If you are interested in the child psychology version, I do recommend Bruno Bettleheim's The Uses of Enchantment. I have not gotten very far into it because it is like really, really deeply about psychology, which is not really my area of expertise. And then one book that I I have heard very well recommended is, I believe it's Tending the Heart of Virtue, which is very well respected in classical circles. But like I said, I haven't quite dug into that yet. The other reading in general, I would say C.S. Lewis's not The Discarded Image, that's what I was just thinking of. An Experiment in Criticism, that's what it is. So C.S. Lewis's An Experiment in Criticism is like all about reading and how we read. It is fascinating. And it shares a lot of, he kind of says a lot of the same things in that and in his essay on 3 ways of writing for children. Okay, we got a big one. Okay. Yeah, I was wondering if this would come up. How do we find modern fairy tales disengage our souls from the joy which is our birthright by God's design? I think of WandaVision, which is a Marvel comic story that I find instinctively different than others, which enlighten ourselves toward truth, beauty, and goodness. There's a lot going on in that question. I also watched WandaVision. I thought about addressing our mild obsession with superhero stories, because I do kind of think that they are modern myths. They have like become like the Greek gods were to the Greeks, that these comic book characters have become like that. So how do we find them disengage our souls from the joy which is our birthright by God's design? I think it's important to realize, or not realize, that's but to recognize. I think it's important to recognize that we can't force a story to be anything other than what it is. Like that in particular, like WandaVision was all about processing grief, which is a very good story to tell. It wasn't really about reconnecting with joy, but about processing grief. Now that could be a lively conversation we have if we had more time. But I think in many ways fairy stories and like comic book movies actually share a lot of the same DNA. And I can only think of one example on the spot, but at the end of Avengers Endgame, all the people who are snapped out of existence like come back, and like it's a big overblown movie. It's like full to the point of bursting, so not really that great of a movie on its own. But that moment where they all come out of these like magical portals, it just really communicated to me that these people were saying, you took away my right to live, and I am going to fight for this. And I actually kind of thought about like all of the souls of babies that we have lost coming back and saying, no, I deserve the right to live. And so to me, that was a huge connection I made to the reality and the truth of our world, that life is worth living. Sorry, if I dipped out there. My computer kind of decided to go to sleep. Did the sound cut out as well? Okay. We're running a new tech system, so we kind of are testing some things out. But anyway, I think we can see that. We can see other things in the movies. I would just kind of be rambling at that point. Although I'm happy to. Looks like there's another one. Is there a particular way that classical education helps us learn these types of lessons in literature? That's a pretty broad question. It's a good one, but it is pretty broad. Classical education, the way we approach literature is very much focused on the text and what the text has to say to us. Sometimes that we bring in the author, but we never really know what the author has to say about that. What I said about like meaning and like literature, fairy stories like nature presents us with possible meanings. And so for myself, I really try not to boil a story down to just one interpretation. That being said, an author has a point of view. Like, they have a view of the world that they are trying to communicate. And so for two people to read the same book and like get two completely different views on it is a little unusual. And so like, I as a teacher try to shepherd, but never try to dictate what they're seeing in a work of literature. But they also need the skills, especially for our junior high students. We work a lot on, why did the author use that word? That is a little different from how you read fairy stories, to be honest. Or fairy tales, rather. Like fairy tales, you're looking at the broad scope of the story, whereas with literature, we do a lot more exercises in close reading, just to make sure that the students are not sort of like flying off on their own interpretation. But we really focus on like, what is the worldview that they are presenting? What does this author have to say about the human experience? And how does it point to what truth is there? What goodness is there? Where's the beauty in the language? And so I do think the transcendentals, the three transcendentals, really are woven throughout how we teach literature. Oh, okay. So it was wonderful to be with you here tonight. I am always willing to talk about this subject. Like I said, there's like a whole other talk that I could give about what Tolkien calls subcreation, and our work as makers, as creators in the divine creator's image. But like I said, that's for another talk. So thank you for joining me tonight. Before we go, I do have a few invitations. Enrollment is currently open for new students. So if you have been intrigued by what you've heard about St. Ambrose, we encourage you to contact us and our Director of Enrollment, Angela Heinlein, who will reach out to answer all your questions about academics, tuition assistance, and much more. You can call 608-827-5863. or send us a message at ambroseacademy.org/contact. Second, our postponed musical, Singin' in the Rain, is finally coming to the stage. I'm very excited about this. Our students put on an outstanding show, and you don't want to miss this. Because of in-person limitations, we've hired a professional team to produce a multi-camera live stream so that audiences near and far can experience the lively dancing and fun of this show. Passes can be purchased for our March 26th through 28th showtimes at ambroseacademy.org/musical. And our final Spotlight series this spring will take place on April 20th with Dr. Mary Skemp, who has been taking some of the senior high through Dante's Inferno this year. She'll be sharing more about this classic text and the insights and questions students bring to the table when digging into a great work of literature such as this. She and I have been talking about this topic, and we have a lot of fun between the two of us, and so I'm very excited to what she has to say. You can find that event on the St. Ambrose Facebook event page, and we'll also be broadcasting live on YouTube. Thank you again for joining me tonight and for your interest in St. Ambrose Academy. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.